Galapagos by Kurt Vonnegut, Book 1, The Thing Was. The thing was, 1 million years ago, back in 1986 AD, Guayaquil was the chief seaport of the little South American democracy of Ecuador, whose capital was Quito, high in the Andes Mountains. Guayaquil was 2 degrees south of the equator, the imaginary belly band of the planet after which the country itself was named. It was always very hot there, and humid too, for the city was built in the doldrums, on a springy marsh through which the mingled waters of several rivers draining the mountains flowed. This seaport was several kilometers from the open sea. Rafts of vegetable matter often clogged the soupy waters, engulfing pilings and anchor lines. Human beings had much bigger brains back then than they do today, and so they could be beguiled by mysteries. One such mystery in 1986 was how so many creatures which could not swim great distances had reached the Galapagos Islands, an archipelago of volcanic peaks due west of Guayaquil, separated from the mainland by 1,000 kilometers of very deep water, very cold water, fresh from the Antarctic. When human beings discovered those islands, there were already geckos and iguanas and rice rats and lava lizards and spiders and ants and beetles and grasshoppers and mites and ticks in residence, not to mention enormous land tortoises. What form of transportation had they used? Many people were able to satisfy their big brains with this answer. They came on natural rafts. Other people argued that such rafts became waterlogged and rotted to pieces so quickly that nobody had ever seen one out of sight of land, and that the current between the islands and the mainland would carry such a rustic vessel northward rather than westward. Or they asserted that all those land-lubberly creatures had walked dry-shod across a natural bridge or had swum distances between stepping stones, that one such formation or another had since disappeared beneath the waves. But scientists using their big brains and cunning instruments had by 1986 made maps of the ocean floor. There wasn't a trace, they said, of an intervening landmass of any kind. Other people, back in that era of big brains and fancy thinking, asserted that the islands had once been part of the mainland and had been split off by some stupendous catastrophe. But the islands didn't look as though they had been split off from anything. They were clearly young volcanoes, which had been vomited up right where they were. Many of them were such newborns out there that they could be expected to blow again at any time. Back in 1986, they hadn't even sprouted much coral yet, and so were without blue lagoons and white beaches, amenities many human beings used to regard as foretastes of an ideal afterlife. A million years later, they do possess white beaches and blue lagoons, but when the story begins, there are still ugly humps and domes and cones and spires of lava, brittle and abrasive, whose cracks and pits and bowls and valleys brimmed over not with rich topsoil or sweet water, but with the finest, driest volcanic ash. Another theory back then was that God Almighty had created all those creatures where the explorers found them. Another theory was that they had been shooed ashore there 2 by 2 down the gangplank of Noah's Ark. If there really was a Noah's Ark, and there may have been, I might entitle my story A Second Noah's Ark. Chapter 2. There was no mystery 1 million years ago as to how a 35-year-old American male named James Waite, who could not swim a stroke, intended to get from South American continent to Galapagos Islands. He certainly wasn't going to squat in a natural raft of vegetable matter and hope for the best. He had just bought a ticket at his hotel in the downtown Guayaquil for a 2 week cruise on what was to be the maiden voyage of a new passenger ship called the Bahia de Darwin, Spanish for Darwin's Bay. This first Galapagos trip for the ship, which flew the Ecuadorian flag, had been publicized and advertised all over the world during the past year as the nature cruise of the century.